So it was interesting, that the British have this wonderful habit of shirking definitions in favor of tradition, which is a prime instance of that, I guess, is practicing democracy without a written constitution. And when I asked for a brief, I asked a very Greek question when I was had the honor to be invited to give this year's Dabis Lecture. So I asked, what is the principle, what is the archi proti, Aristotle would say, the principle guiding the speaker on the choice of subjects. So it turned out this was a very Greek question. I got a very British answer. Instead of a principle, I was sent a list of past titles to make my own deductions. So I deduced that inductively that classics and the importance of classics is a necessary part of the plat du jour, and that we have to add some contemporary relevance to make it tastier. But in fact, this is not just about cooking. It was a great opportunity for which I'm grateful to speak about something that is dear to me, and something that perhaps, although I think about a lot, maybe at an unconscious or half-conscious level, or when thinking in different manners than those of a writer. In my writing, or when I think about my writing, I don't really think about so much. So this gave me a good opportunity to focus, for which I'm very grateful. So I will take Aristotle's advice in the rhetoric and begin with what he calls an ethos argument, an argument of character, which means, of course, in this context, the speaker's character. The orator, he writes in the rhetoric, persuades when his speech is delivered in such a manner as to render him worthy of confidence. This makes good sense. Your opinion of a speaker will heavily prejudice you as to the value of what is being said, and if the speaker can influence this opinion, he should by all means do so. But I'm in a difficult position here tonight. I am addressing an audience partly consisting, at least, of eminent scholars, without myself being one, not in any formal sense anyway. I'm a storyteller, a writer, and it is as such that you have invited me. So in order to persuade you of anything, to be worthy of your confidence, I must begin with a confession and confess my true nature. And of course ask you to follow me from academia to my own turf. I will address you from there, where I feel more comfortable, though often looking outwards in many directions, including academia, as writers are bound to do, unless they be of the omphaloscopic, the navel-gazing variety, which I hope I'm not. My aim is to address what I believe to be the most important question a writer can ask, faced with the prodigious legacy of ancient Greece. What can I learn from it, precisely about my vocation, writing? So, the title of my lecture needs a slight clarification. When I refer to what a writer can learn from the Greeks, I mean really one writer, myself. If the answer can be of more general application, even better. I'm inspired in this attempt by the words of Rémy de Gourmont, quoted by T.S. Eliot at the start of his Perfect Critic. To raise one's personal impressions into laws is a man's great task if he is sincere. So, in all sincerity, I proceed. Now, in order to be able to address the question I pose with some intelligence within the appointed time, I will have to delimit its range from all the wonders left to us by the ancient Greeks. I will focus on the most important genre of the classical age, tragedy, which I will look at partly, though not exclusively, with the aid of Greece's two greatest philosophers, Plato and Aristotle. Maybe some of you will find this strange, that a writer adopts the viewpoint of theorists, however great they may be. I'm reminded here of Barnett Newman's wisecrack that aesthetics is to the artist as ornithology is to the bird. Yet a partly theoretical viewpoint does not contradict my statement of ethos as writer, for even tragedy included in its exquisite poetry the element of the anoia, or thought, in the parts in which its characters, Aristotle writes, prove that something is or is not the case, or declare a general view. So yes, even writers can think and should on occasion attempt to do so. My discussion of tragedy will be organized around 4 topics. For the first 3 of these, Mimesis, Catharsis, and plot, I will be guided by Aristotle's great work, the Poetics. The 4th, which I call function, is largely a departure from it, but we'll come to that. So we have here Rembrandt's Homer, Aristotle contemplating a bust of Homer, a perfect icon for an idealized vision of the Poetics, a work often referred to as the first work of literary criticism in history. Yet the Poetics was actually not even Aristotle's first book on poetry, and not probably his big one, let's say, on the subject, the equivalent of what, say, the Analytics was on the syllogism. That was a book called On Poets, which sadly is non-extant. We don't know what the need for another one for the Poetics was, but it is a reasonable conjecture that the Poetics was some form of lecture notes, perhaps, which that Aristotle used for his lectures at the Lyceum, his school, in Athens, his philosophical school, around 330 BCE, plus or minus a few years. The text we possess is incomplete, the part in comedy, and maybe more is missing. And what is left is not a very systematic work. It is uneven in its emphasis on the various topics, indeed showing many of the characteristics of what we would call a non-final draft. Now, the Poetics was not principally anyway, a how-to book for aspiring tragedians. After all, Aristotle was not a poet. Yet there are statements in it that are hard to interpret in any other way, as, for example, this one: the poet should lay out the general structure of the tragedy, and only then develop the sequence of episodes. And then this is followed by an example from Oedipus Rex, giving an example of what Aristotle means by this general structure. It's more or less what we would call an outline. To me, this sounds like it's straight out of a creative writing course, though of course it's not. Still, the Poetics, unlike, say, the logical books of what's known as the Organon, which are structured through argument, mixes the modes of description, the poetry of archaic and classical Greece, with the normative, the evaluative, and the prescriptive, exactly as modern how-to manuals do. The Poetics begins in typical Aristotelian fashion, with the author declaring that he intends to speak on poetry from first principles, από τον πρώτον. The first of these, the first axiom, Euclid would say, is the statement that poetry is a kind of mimesis, mimesis. The word is not defined by Aristotle, so we have to refer to its common usage in his time and translate it as imitation or representation, perhaps, and sometimes the one is more appropriate than the other as translation. This is a great, very, very famous definition of tragedy by Aristotle, which in an approximate translation, I use Stephen Halliwell's translation from the Poetics, but I've changed a word or two, says tragedy is the mimesis, the mimesis of an action, which is elevated, spodaia, or serious, complete, and of magnitude, a certain length, a certain duration, in a language embellished by distinct forms in its sections, employing the mode of enactment, not storytelling. Halliwell translates this as narrative, and through pity and fear accomplishing the catharsis of such emotions. Let us look at the first part. First, the part defining tragedy as an imitation of a certain kind of action. This, I believe, contains a pointer to a secret agenda of the Poetics, to provide a counter-argument to the views of Plato, who was Aristotle's teacher, of course, with whom he later disagreed on many things, including poetry. So it's an answer to Plato's views on poetry, but also, at the same time, interestingly, a fulfillment of one of Plato's less publicized wishes. You remember, of course, the notorious pronouncement of Plato expressed in Book 10 of the Republic, where he, as Socrates, exiles poets from his ideal city-state and exiles poetry, deeming it to be destructive of character. Yet, though he has been excessively bad-mouthed about this, it is clear from various passages of the Republic, some in the 10th chapter, that Plato has mixed feelings about poetry. Or rather, to be precise, his feelings are totally positive, but he tells us that it is his better judgment that prevails when he decides to exile the poets. But even after he has pronounced his sentence on poetry, Plato adds that he would welcome an apology, wanting her defenders, poetry's defenders, to speak, and says, "We shall be good listeners, since it will clearly be to our advantage if it is shown that poetry is a good thing as well as a pleasurable one." And this is sometimes we forget when we think of Plato as an enemy of poetry. So, in the Poetics, Aristotle has taken it upon himself to offer precisely this apology aimed at overturning the Platonic argument. By including mimesis in the definition, he makes it clear from the start that Plato and I are really talking about the same thing. Now, in Plato's view, poetry is not once, but twice removed from reality. A lie, twice over. This is, of course, an outcome of his theory of the nature of reality, emblematically captured in the myth of the cave, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. And very, very roughly and schematically, the idea in the myth of the cave as an analogy of people's blindness to real reality is that real reality is out here. We, living in this world, are prisoners in a cave and do not see, in fact, the reality itself, which is out here, but projections. There's a light back here which projects images on this wall. So we see this world around us here and mistake it for reality. But reality, the ideal reality, real reality, let's call it, is elsewhere. So firstly, we have the real reality, the world of Eidoi, the ideas. Secondly, we have the world of the shadows they cast. This world we perceive around us, and then the world of art. I'll give you an example. Take the concept of writer. In the world of ideas, you have the eidos, the ideal writer. In the real world, you are stuck with imitations, like myself. And then, thirdly, you have art, the imitation of the imitation, for example, here. Well, this is a particular case, I guess, where the imitation of the imitation looks better than the imitation, but that is not always the case. Now, Plato's negative assessment of art still carries a lot of weight today, a weight not always acknowledged. The modern Greek philosopher, there is such a thing, Alexander Nehamas, writing from Princeton, not Athens, discusses a modern analogy. Even the most liberal among us, Nehamas says, were absolutely shocked by Plato's expulsion of the poets, takes the Platonic stance when we prohibit our children to watch a certain program on television. When I was growing up in Greece, incidentally, there was still no television back in the 60s, so that was a prohibition to read comic books, a prohibition which I'm happy to say my parents were not successful in enforcing in my case. There is a good reason, though, behind such prohibitions, we'll say. They don't have to be Platonic. Children are too young, don't know any better. But behind it, if we notice, hides the hidden, the unspoken premise that we ascribe huge power to mimesis, the power to infect, to corrupt. We acknowledge that the imitation of images on a screen is so powerful that it can corrupt the soul. So we are not clean of the Platonic bug. None of us, not even writers. In fact, writers are especially sensitive to it. Of course, most writers won't be caught dead admitting that they are crypto-Platonists. It would be bad for business, for one thing. But even those who vehemently denounce Plato as a proto-fascist, those of us, exhibit the unmistakable stigma of the Platonic view of art in the neurosis that is endemic to the writing community. For us, with members of that other highly mimetic, also highly neurotic profession, acting, writers' emotional turmoils, I think, are inextricable from the fact that they have to live most of their lives in this ontological netherworld of shadows of shadows. What makes this pathology worse, of course, is that writers are addicted to producing these double limitations. In fact, that's why they become writers when they grow up. When they're little, they are mere fantasists. With addiction comes guilt. When the great Irish writer Brendan Behan was once asked to describe himself, he said, "I'm a drinker with a writing problem." In fact, all writers, drinkers or non-drinkers, are really just people with a writing problem. Ask a writer why he or she writes, book after book after book, and you'll get a choice from a standard repertory of responses. You read them in interviews often. From the hypocritically modest, "That's the only thing I know how to do," to the thinly disguised megalomaniacal, "I owe it to my readers." But Aristotle has a better answer, which is very guilt-absolving. We create imitations of life because it's natural to do so. His words, "It is in the nature of human beings from childhood to imitate, which is also the way they learn their first lessons." Nature also explains why readers read or viewers view. Aristotle again, "No less universal is the pleasure we feel in things imitated." And so readers and spectators too get, thank God, some share of the guilt for our addiction. Think of the sense of emptiness that comes over you when you've just spent hours and hours over the weekend watching the 11th season of that favorite series on DVD, or when you finally put down that unput-downable novel which couldn't let you off its grip for the past 5 hours on the beach, and which you totally forget the moment you finished it, with only the sunburn to remind you. You re-emerge into the world feeling the malaise of too much imitation. In fact, the more convincing imitation is, Nehamas here uses the term transparent, the more transparent, the worse the malaise. Now, Plato would have no problem with this. He would have no problem at all with Aristotle's view of imitation as an instinct. But to him, you see, this would clinch the case against it. Because in his view, instincts emanate from our baser self, the source of appetites, passions, all things bad. But of course there is more to Plato's attack against poetry than its being a double imitation. For even to him, imitation can have a usefulness. Indeed, in Book 10 of the Republic, he makes an exception from the banishment of the poets, allowing those who write paeans to the gods and great men, hymns to the god and great men, to remain. And in Book 3, while discussing the education of the guardians, the future, let's say, philosopher kings of the city, of the ideal city, he says, as Socrates, "Our first business is to supervise the production of stories and choose only those we think suitable and reject the rest." So even double imitation stories can be useful provided they imitate the right things. In fact, Plato makes it clear that the poets he exiles from his ideal city are practitioners of techni mimitiki, the art of effective imitation of all and sundry good things and bad alike, with tragedy specializing, of course, in the very worst. André Gide has said famously, "Le bon sentiment font de la mauvaise littérature." Noble feelings make bad literature, and Plato's criteria are most definitely not French. The heart of the problem with tragedy, he believes, is that its characters' sufferings, which are largely their own doing, as well as their immoderate reactions to them, are highly contagious, infectious, and thus the public representation in tragedy can be destructive of character, of soul. Aristotle, on the contrary, thinks that the effect of the passions, when transformed into poetry, is homeopathic, let us say. That being exposed to them in the form of tragedy is good for you. Going back to the definition, the last part of it, the ελάιο και φόβο περαίνουσα την των τιού των παθημάτων κάθαρσιν, which is the most famous statement perhaps in the Poetics, which says that tragedy through pity and fear accomplishes the catharsis of such emotions. Now, had the blessed man taken the pain to write a line or two more here, he would have saved subsequent generations an enormous amount of work, all aimed at elucidating the meaning of this one word, catharsis. But perhaps it is just as well that he didn't, for if he had explained it clearly, the Poetics would not have received the attention of so many poets, old and new, who prefer dark mirrors to spotlessly clean ones, as they allow much more elbow space to the imagination. The common usage of the word catharsis in Aristotle's time was in the context of ritual and medicine, with the related meanings of purification and purgation. Yet, in a recent summary of what he refers to as his increasingly skeptical views on catharsis, Stephen Halliwell, undoubtedly one of the greatest modern students of the Poetics, simply translates the term as cleansing. This is indeed one of the ancient meanings, perhaps the most central, the literal one, of which all others are probably metaphorical variations. And actually, I have my own reason for liking Halliwell's variation, for when I walk in present-day Athens, very often I see signs like this here, okay, Catharisteriou, you see, Cathar, the same root, which means laundry, the cleaners. Concluding a review of modern interpretations of catharsis, most of which he finds, as he says, depressingly self-confident, Halliwell writes that we are more likely to approximate to the truth if we also take into account the wider principle that the pleasure derived from mimetic works of art rests on an underlying process of comprehension, a process to which a concept of mean or balance is not foreign. This, of course, is a conception of tragedy, of catharsis, and thus of tragedy quite different from the periodically fashionable views of tragedy as a wild, ecstatic ritual by means of which we are supposed to reach illumination through a condition of Bacchic ecstasy. Now, my lecture's title promises, if no one else, then to the lecturer, some extrapolations from ancient meanings to modern lessons. Let me attempt the first of these. The Platonic accusation against poetry only becomes possible in an age that is moving away from a sacred worldview, with a corresponding shift in the locus where art is practiced, from the temple to the marketplace. But to think of imitation as second-hand copy is only possible if the material world it represents has stopped being regarded as enchanted. And that, of course, is including human beings. For the view of art in the ancient traditions, the ancient sacred traditions, is as a rule iconolatric. You can see this even today, for example, in the dogma and practice of the self-confessedly iconolatric Eastern Orthodox Church. In it, the icon is perceived of as holy, iera eikon. It is not mere imitation, because in exact analogy with the sainted persons it represents, its ontology, as the ontology of the persons, occupies a liminal state, partaking both of the divine and the human. Yet this conception of art as a gateway to a deeper truth is the usually unacknowledged dream of any writer who has ever hoped to be more than mere entertainer, who has ever hoped that his or her art will do more than provide a pleasant way for a reader to kill time. And I think that there isn't really a writer in the world who has never hoped that for one of his works. Of course, in an age such as ours, lacking the strong connecting myths of a generally accepted religion, the depth is often sought elsewhere, say in an idealized vision of nature or the dark recesses of the soul for the Romantics, or in some new concept of enchantment, a mixture of the cognitive and the mystical in various variations of Romanticism, such as the over-reality, the surrealité of the surrealists, or James Joyce's Epiphanies, or even in an author's private quasi-metaphysics. Yet a vision of literature as a return to real reality is too demanding a vision for the comfort of most of us. It can inspire some lucky or not so lucky, depending on how you look at it, few, as in the case of the great visionary poets like William Blake, say, or Yeats, or some semi-visionary ones like Pound or T.S. Eliot. But it is a dream too extreme to dominate most writers' lives, especially the writers of fiction, whose ambition is usually somewhat more modest than capturing the mystical essence of being in a net of words, need a more down-to-earth guiding principle in order not to go mad or make total fools of themselves. To acknowledge that our work is mimetic is the first necessity. Without the centripetal force of mimesis, a writer cannot survive for too long, either in the metaphorical or actually the literal sense. For the centrifugal forces all around us, ready to obliterate whatever substance there is in our phantasms, are too strong. The market, fashion, stylistic narcissism, innovation for the sake of innovation, but also didacticism or the blind subjection to ideology. To fight these, we must again and again return to the old truth that at the heart, not just of tragedy, but of all fiction, is the mimesis of action. Yet without the outward trajectory towards catharsis, without a final aim that is neither solely contained in the work, nor trivial, but aims at a transformation, however slight or temporary, of the mind and psyche of a reader, a transformation in the direction of the telos, the aim, the goal of human beings, which is always, according to Aristotle, happiness defined as not unrelated to the concept of the good. Without this outer trajectory, a work of mimetic art will remain something less than what it could be. And that is always a betrayal of purpose, always a shame. The poetic narrative tradition is in the Aristotelian tradition of narrative that is worth defending. This takes us to the aspect of his
Congenistic Catharsis is related to harmony and rhythm, or what we may call more generally form. To merely reproduce what our senses perceive in our daily lives, the chaotic, unfolding narratives we live in, may be pleasurable sometimes in a voyeuristic sort of sense, but it is not poetry. Of course, by harmony and rhythm, Aristotle also refers to the lyrical aspects of poetry. Poetry as heightened speech. Yet in tragedy, the form-giving instinct is mainly incarnated in plot, which Aristotle calls mythos, defining it as the composition of events, the synthesis pragmatum. He then states that the plot is, in fact, the imitation, a very striking statement. Es etis praxos o mythos in mimesis. Plot, he writes furthermore, is the goal, telos of tragedy, the goal being the most important thing of all. And there is more. The plot is the first principle and, as it were, the soul of tragedy, he tells us. So Aristotle couldn't be more clear on its importance. I'll try to give you in a nutshell the basic characteristics of the perfect tragedy as presented in the Poetics. A model that, though it also concerns the choice of subject, the subject behind the story, the plot, is more about its transformation into plot. So, the ideal Aristotelian tragedy imitates an action that contains pitiable, eleina, and terrifying fovera elements, usually involving close relatives or philoi. Best tragedies, as we know from Aristotle, concern dramas, tragedies among friends or people who are very close, usually family. Centers on one main event, the result of hamartia, of a failing of the main character, who must be neither very good nor very bad. It has a bipartite structure, thesis, the tying, complication, and lysis, denouement, untying. The turning point linking them, if you see it as this structure, is either a peripeteia, a reversal of fortune, or an anagnorisis, a recognition, a sudden understanding, seeing of something that wasn't seen before by a character. The form is long enough to cover the structure of the central event, but not longer. The whole is harmonious in the congruence of its parts, like an animal, like a living being, Aristotle tells us.
an element of this harmony being the existence of a clear beginning, middle, and an end. You know, they say that Jean-Luc Godard of the Nouvelle Vague back in the 60s said that every film should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. Aristotle obviously believed that the order should be given. All the events are probable and explainable through the action, with no illogical. Alloga is the word Aristotle uses, the opposite of elloga, those with reason, or superfluous elements. The work is self-contained. All or almost all important events are inside the plot, and especially the events causing events in the plot, and the work has closure, no loose ends. Now, characteristics 1 to 4, these 4 are more characteristic, are more germane to the ideal tragic form, while the rest also belong to a more generic, a bigger, larger, more encompassing narrative structure, subsuming it. Nick Lowe of this university, he's somewhere there in the dark, in an important book calls this structure the classical plot, arguing convincingly that it does not represent a natural, cognitive universal, but was essentially invented and certainly established as dominant in certain genres of archaic and classical literature, primarily epic and tragedy. However, though the classical plot, as Nick Lowe defines it, is an invention of the poets, not the theorists, as Lowe also points out, the Poetics played a big part in establishing it as prototypical narrative form, defining the course of Western literature. Now, you don't need me to tell you, of course, that texts are more often misread than read. And great classical texts are especially prone to misreadings. In fact, they're more often referred to in order to provide higher authority for the reader's views than to enlighten him or her with their own. But setting the endless misinterpretations of Catharsis aside, the Poetics contains a nucleus of meaning that is hard to misread. To identify it, let me make a rather surprising turn towards a place as far as can be from classical Greece. Indeed, in the past few decades, Aristotle has become very hot. In Hollywood, I use the Americanism for local color. This is obviously apparent in the subgenre of how-to manuals, presuming to teach the art of screenwriting. In fact, there are now 3 such in the past few years with Aristotle in the title. This, Aristotle's Poetics for Screenwriters, is the one whose title, somewhat shortened, I borrowed for use in the title of my lecture. It was written by Michael Tierno and published in 2002. And there are 2 more, the first also published in 2002 and the second in 2008, both written by the very appropriately named Ari Hiltunen. Aristotle in Hollywood, then Successful Entertainment and Aristotle's Poetics. Now, Tierno and Hiltunen are studio executives whose jobs involve helping studios choose which scripts to buy and advising producers on how to play around with their elements once they are bought. So, though no experts on Aristotle, they do know their Hollywood. Yet, as neither of them is yet a household name exactly, it is more instructive to look for the influence of Aristotle in Hollywood in the ideas on the 2 greatest modern gurus of screenwriting, these being, of course, if you know anything about this, Sid Field, author of Screenplay, The Foundations of Screenwriting, and Robert McKee, author of a book called Story. Field's and McKee's books have exerted a huge influence at Hollywood, and not just on aspiring screenwriters. Their terminology, the inciting incident, the point of attack, the plot point, the antagonist, the raising of the stakes, the payoff, and so on, are by now standard industry jargon, and their models provide keys in Hollywood to thinking about narrative structure. On occasion, of course, they also provide alternatives to thinking. More importantly for us, both Field and McKee are self-confessed Aristotelians. Here is Sid Field modestly reflecting on his discovery of what he, not so modestly, calls the paradigm. his universal model for the perfect screenplay. I simply uncovered what was already there in dramatic structure, given it a name and shown how it works in contemporary movies, a concept of storytelling that has been around since Aristotle's time. Aristotle's name is mentioned 6 times in Field's book. And here is Robert McKee. There's been no conspiracy to keep secret the truths of our art. In the 23 centuries since Aristotle wrote the Poetics, the secrets of story have been as public as the library down the street. Aristotle is mentioned 12 times in McKee. So taking into account that Field's book was published in 1979 and McKee's in 1997, we could say that Aristotle's influence in Hollywood has exactly doubled in 18 years. Now, as Nicola writes, Aristotle's name is often taken in vain in Hollywood. In fact, as a rule, in these Hollywood manuals. But still, the ventures of Field and McKee are in a very essential way Aristotelian. For reasons of time, I will only discuss briefly Field's paradigm, his one and only model of what constitutes a good film, what I'm tempted to call general field theory. As regards the universality of its application, Sid Field is unequivocal. The rhetorical question he poses, do all good films fit the paradigm? He answers in one word, yes. So this is Sid Field's paradigm. This, Sid Field tells us, is everything we should know about the structure of the perfect movie. Some points to note. The action is organized in 3 acts: setup, confrontation, and resolution. This is the number of pages. The rule of thumb in screenwriting is that it's about a minute per page, so it's first half hour, 1 hour, last half hour, roughly. This is presented in Field as an application of the principle of the Poetics. Every action has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Of course, like a lot in Field, this interpretation of the 3-act structure, as going back to Aristotle, is much older. You find it in theatrical handbooks of, say, Gustav Freytag and so on, already in the 19th century. We'll give you a few examples to see what these are like in a film that many of you will know. It's a film that's been a lot in the press. I think had every reason to be. A wonderful film, The King's Speech, which won all the Oscars this year. Okay, so if you've seen the film, and this may contain 1 or 2 spoilers, so if you haven't seen The King's Speech, cover your ears. So if you've seen The King's Speech, the inciting incident, which Field tells us we should sniff for around minute 10, about the 10th page of the screenplay, is the point when the prince, then Prince Albert as Duke of York, future King George VI, has this terrible stuttering problem. The first scene at Wembley shows us how bad it is. And then he goes to one after another, the great Harley Street specialists. There's only one of them in the film, but it's obvious that he's the last in a series of great specialists, and he fails to cure the king, and then he says, that's it, and then the princess, the queen-to-be, the queen, later Queen Mum-to-be, decides to take him to a man of not such great reputation, Lionel Logg. So this is the inciting incident. This begins their relationship. Now, the transition from act to act, which Field tells us is really plot point 1 and plot point 2, and this is around pages 27 or 28 or 87 or 88, is, and this is the definition of a plot point, is any incident, episode or event that hooks into the action and spins it around in another direction. So if it's going that way, it goes that way, and if it's going that way, it goes that way. This is a formal analog of the Aristotelian peripeteia, of course, also applying to anagnorisis. Either one, the peripeteia, or the anagnorisis would make an ideal plot point. And a basic Fieldian rule, a plot point is always a function of the main character. This is very interesting. It's not in the Poetics, not in so many words anyway, though the demand for closure and economy and the ban on powers outside the play operating on it, which lead to it in the Poetics, are. Let's see it in the King's Speech, for example. First of all, you have to define the protagonist, okay? An accepted Hollywood wisdom, which is also accepted storytelling wisdom in a sense, unspoken, is that the protagonist is that the character, man or woman, that during the course of the film or play or novel or whatever it is, changes, does not remain the same. Suffers the change, the peripeteia, the change of fortune or whatever. So in the King's Speech, the protagonist is definitely the king, not Lionel Log. We see it also in the title, of course. It's interesting, in fact, that the other parts are exactly, I would say, of equal length, equal importance in terms of lines and screen time. The one was nominated for the role of Best Actor, and the other, the man, Geoffrey Rush playing Lionel Log, was for Supporting Actor. Here, the first plot point, which we should sniff around, after the 25th minute or so. In fact, Sid Field says in his book, when you see a film and you sense a plot point, look at your watch. You will probably be 25 to 30 minutes into the action. So that is the point, if you remember the film. At some point, the Prince, Duke of York, is very frustrated with the first meetings of Lionel Log, which are not successful. At one point, Log has read him a text, while over the earphones comes very loud music. And the Prince is reading without being to hear himself. He's furious, and he finishes and says, I had enough of this nonsense, and leaves. And Log gives him a recording, a form of primitive recording device, recording medium of this himself reading, and the king puts it aside. And then later, when he's frustrated, he listens to it, and he hears himself reading without a stutter. That is definitely plot point one, because it is then that he decides to go into this adventure of his apprenticeship with Lionel Log, which is the rest of the film. And of course, Sid Field says there is a midpoint in these films. In fact, in a tragic tale, you would have plot point one, midpoint, plot point two, ending. And in a happy ending story, you would have plot point one, midpoint, plot point two, ending. And say capital M for sad ending and a capital W for happy ending. These two patterns are not in Sid Field, but they're applications of his ideas. And this is an exact analogy also, almost, of the bipartite structure of Aristotle, the thesis and the lysis. And in the King's Speech, again, the midpoint is the moment where it looks likely that the king, King Edward, does not want to be king really because of the affair with Mrs. Simpson, that is thinking of, anyway, there's a problem around his being crowned, and Lionel Log takes a walk in the park. He's taking a walk in the park with the Duke of York, with then Prince of Wales, I guess, and tells him that perhaps you should be king or something. And the prince is furious with him for meddling in affairs which do not concern him, and leaves in the middle of the park and ends his apprenticeship. So that, in a happy ending story, as you can see, is plot point one, midpoint, then we're going almost to plot point two here. Perhaps it's plot point two, and then there is the turning, and he returns, and we go towards the happy end. Now, when a man suggests in total earnestness that every good film has this absurdly rigid pattern, I noticed that you laughed correctly when I talked about the capital M and capital W. You can be led, as you were, to two totally reasonable assumptions. A, that he's a fool, or B, that he is mad. But the sales of Sid Field's books suggest that he's probably not the first. And the continuing grip of his model on the Hollywood imagination makes the second diagnosis of madness rather unlikely. Or, of course, if Sid Field is mad, they're all mad over there, a possibility we should perhaps not completely discard. But, of course, the idea of strict rules for dramatic structure is not Sid Field's discovery. Consider this very rigid rule. A well-constructed plot should be single in its subject rather than double. The change of fortune should be not from bad to good, but reversely, from good to bad. This change should come about as the result not of vice, but of some great error, in a character which is neither very bad or very good. You laughed with the N and the W, you don't laugh here, but this is equally restrictive. And it's, of course, Aristotle proposing very rigid rules for tragedy in addition to the formal restrictions we saw earlier on top of these. So in promoting an ideal template, Field is well within Aristotelian tradition. Of course, Field does not claim to have learned his model from the Poetics, but to have discovered it by induction through examining countless cases of movies and scripts, good and bad. But that, of course, is a quintessentially Aristotelian inductive method. My main point now is that both Aristotle and Sid Field, and if you are shocked by my placing them side by side, that is exactly my purpose, to shock you into an anagnosis, a recognition of the commonality of their ventures, both Aristotle and Sid Field reach results that make good cognitive sense. Of course, their criteria of goodness differ. Sid Field is investigating art as entertainment, translatable in Hollywood very simply to art as box office. Aristotle is more interested, I believe, in art as knowledge. There is a giveaway of this in his remark in the Poetics that poetry is more philosophical, he tells us, philosophoteron, than history, because it deals with universal qualities, ta καθόλου, whereas history deals with particulars, καθ έκαστον. But even if their ultimate goals are different, Aristotle and Sid Field completely coincide in their intermediate goal, which is cognitive effectiveness. Both the Poetics and Field screenplay are studies of what structure is necessary to achieve the best possible affective response in an audience. And thereby hangs a moral or a lesson to a writer, that we can achieve the best response with the right form, and that there is a restricted repertory of basic rightness. Also, there's an underlying lesson, that these principles are best learned in the crucible of an art that addresses a large, mixed, and, as a rule, therefore unforgiving audience, as well as the audience of tragedy, which is what the audience of tragedy in classical times and the audience of Hollywood films today is, large, mixed, and unforgiving. These principles, by contrast, cannot be cultivated of perfect form in an art exclusively addressing a coterie of aesthetes, a coterie which can, guided by intellectual fashion, stomach, and often applaud ecstatically the most enormous amounts of audience or reader unfriendliness. Literary theorist Thomas Pavel remarks astutely that the form any genre imposes on its material is not an abstract a priori requirement, but comes as a consequence of the cultural tasks the genre chooses to fulfill. As we saw, the tasks that the genres Aristotle and Sid Field discuss do not coincide, but that the rules they discover have great structural similarities is an indication that they have a big overlap, at the center of which is precisely the task of winning over a large and mixed and difficult audience. If you want to do that with a narrative form above a certain size, there is one basic mechanism that you cannot do without: plot. The warning here to all writers, old and new, is very simple. Now, of course, plot is an artificial thing, as we saw in these forms, these sort of straitjackets for narrative structure. And it is interesting that often, especially you see this especially with adaptations, when a plot is imposed, because that is often what it is, imposed on biographical or historical material, it often distorts the material crucially to fit ideals or criteria of best or ideal form. And now there's the mega spoiler on the King's Speech, which concerns not the film itself, but the film and the relation to the main story. In the film, there is something rather strange, if you notice it, that this apprenticeship of Lionel Locke teaching the king to speak properly without a stutter is rather long. I mean, it lasts almost 15 years. First event, Wembley, 1925. The first important in those grave times speech is 1939, September. So it takes him 14 years, which I would say, that 14 years, you can probably teach anyone anything. So it doesn't seem such a huge achievement. But of course, the reason for that is that they want, the director and the screenwriter want the king to achieve this result of speaking without a stutter for the first time in this momentous event of speaking, of addressing the British people and the world as the leader of Britain against Nazi Germany, when Britain on September 4th, 1939 enters the war. So it is important for the film. All the suspense of the film hangs on that moment. And if you've seen the film, at that moment you enter with Logue and the king, the booth where he's to address the nation trembling. Will he make it? Will he manage it? And as he begins to do so, and Lionel Logue conducts him, as it were, into the speech with a wonderful accompaniment of Beethoven's the Allegretto from the 7th Symphony, suddenly you feel perhaps catharsis, perhaps a perfect sense of contentment that the goal has been reached. Now the truth is that the king, as Duke of York, spoke without a stutter for the first time in 1926, a year after lessons started, addressing the Australian Parliament. He spoke perfectly without a stutter. He kept Lionel Logue, of course, for the rest of his life as an associate, as a friend, as a coach. But there should have been no agony in this 1939 speech, because the Duke of York and then Prince of Wales and then King was doing fine for the last 13 years. But if that had been in the film, there would be no fun, because, you know, to address the Australian meeting, a plenary meeting of the Australian Parliament in 1926 somehow does not seem as grand as addressing the world as the leader of the free world in 1939. So obviously, I think they did well to do this. This is what makes it a great film. What this is, in fact, makes it a rather trivial story of an apprenticeship. A great film is this transposition. And this, of course, is distortion of reality in the service of effectiveness. So plot is a lot about that. Now, when reading the Poetics, we must not forget that Aristotle wrote it 75 years after the last of the great tragedians, Euripides, had died. He knew their place mainly through texts, and he had seen some revivals. There were revivals already at the time, probably mostly of Euripides. New tragedies were still being produced in his lifetime, of course, even during Aristotle's last year in Athens, when he wrote the Poetics. Of these, sadly, but perhaps significantly, only a few short fragments survive. What we do have, though, is Aristotle's testimony that these were different in at least one significant way from the older plays. The characters in the old tragedies, he writes in the Poetics, spoke politically, politikos. In other words, in a mode known from public speaking, touching upon issues of import to the polis, including matters that we could call ethical. But those of the newer tragedians, the first of which there is reason to believe Aristotle sees in Euripides, who is in fact older, speak rhetorically, rhetorikos, in a manner similar to the technical language of the courtroom cultivated by the sophists. There is no more information on this change in the Poetics. But in the rhetoric, there's an interesting part where Aristotle speaks of the older style in a rather disparaging tone. With orators of old, he writes, the language of prose that first took a poetical color to such an extent that even now, in his time, the uneducated think that poetical language makes the finest discourses. But Aristotle knows better. The language of prose, he writes, is distinct from that of poetry, and, he implies, much more effective, which can be seen from the fact that, as he writes, today, in his day, even the language of tragedy has altered its character and has become much simpler, much closer to the logical language of prose, or more rhetorical. There is here definitely the tone of approval. But Aristotle's belief that a simpler language works better for tragedy is the prejudice of an analytic, of an overeducated mind, leading to a warped view of the poetic virtues of old-style tragedy. And as so much else about it, For you see, though Aristotle's homeopathic theory of the mimesis of the passions is central to the task of the Poetics as a defense of poetry against Plato's attack, there is no way to know that this description of its function corresponds to what made tragedy such a hugely successful and influential genre at the time of its prime, in the 5th century BC. The culture of 5th century Athens was, of course, very different from our own. And thus, a big part of the experience of tragedy for the audience for which it was created is today lost in translation, not just to another language, but to another place, time, culture, to an altogether different worldview, to radically different conditions of performance of theater. However, that the function of 5th century tragedy, and thus its essence, is opaque to us, is rather obvious. What is not so obvious, however, is that it was also opaque to the razor-sharp, no-nonsense, inquiring and scientific mind of a man who wrote about it in the late 4th century BC. But it was indeed opaque to him, as we see from his work, the Poetics. For Aristotle did not live in what Jean-Pierre Vernon, the great French classicist who died last year, called the moment of tragedy, the time of the great civic and cultural transformation of late 6th and 5th century Athens, the transformation that both created tragedy and was crucially affected by it in a two-way interaction. The great British classical scholar T.B.L. Webster writes, Aristotle's praise of classical tragedy excludes comment on man's relation to the gods, the moral stature of heroes and heroines, and choruses, while including all that was common to the classical tragedians and his contemporary tragedians. In other words, in Webster's opinion, which, for whatever it's worth, I share, Aristotle views the old through the lens of the new, practicing a form of literary Whig history that makes the Poetics, though it is in modern terms very good cognitive narratology, it's bad theater history, and we don't even want to discuss it as performance studies or reception theory. Totally terrible. Let us look very briefly at the ignored aspects of tragedy that Webster mentions, aspects we cannot even begin to understand from the Poetics, or for that matter, from studying the optimal tricks of the popular narrative art of our own times, à la manière de Sid Field. To understand them, we have to abandon Aristotle's theorizing about tragedy and look at the plays themselves, in context. And here, the going gets much harder, for it is much easier to describe and thus to imitate form than substance. In fact, that's why you don't see any Aeschylus for Hollywood manuals, just Aristotle for Hollywood. Webster writes that Aristotle ignores tragedy as comment on man's relation to the gods. This aspect is intimately related, of course, to the fact that almost all classical tragedies, and that is a huge number, although we have less than 40 extant, it is very likely that as many as at least 1,000 were written in the 5th century alone. All these take the subjects from pre-existing legendary, what we sometimes call mythological material. In fact, Aristotle mentions only one exception, only a single tragedy which does not come from legendary material, but is originally invented, Agathon's Antheos. In the 5th century, especially the first part of it, when tragedy is born, what we usually call mythology now is still very much so a power-determining Athenian thought. Its heroes, whose tales were transmitted by the oral tradition, live in a world that is, in a sense, naturally closer to the gods. We see this clearly in Homer, this constant interaction of mortals and immortals, the countless stories of direct divine intervention in human affairs. The personification of the divine dominating archaic Greek thought does not need to be accompanied by full belief in the gods or in the more extreme supernatural doings of the demigods to be an effective metaphor for discussing, in narrative language, the relation of human beings to powers that transcend them, as narrative does. It's crucial to understand this because we don't know the degree of belief of the average Greek, especially in the 5th century, in these things. But the tales of the heroes especially do need at least a certain basic level of belief if their use as metaphor is to have the power to affect an audience deeply. This cannot survive in a climate of radical doubt. And we do know that at least the beginning of the 5th century, the end of the Archaic Age, the beginning of the Classical, there was a level of belief, not perhaps that Achilles had performed those labors with supernatural help, but that he had indeed, there was this great man who had done these great things in the past of the culture. This kind of belief in myth, even a small degree, cannot survive in a climate of radical doubt. And it is for this reason that, as Peter Buren writes, once myth is in doubt, tragedy becomes marginal. Myth has already begun to be seriously in doubt in the last decades of the 5th century, i.e. the time when tragedy has begun its transformation from principally cosmological and political to rhetorical, logical in language and psychological in subject matter. And myth has become totally discredited a century later, if not to everyone, then at least to intellectuals like the late tragedians and of course Aristotle. Aristotle takes for granted the fact that the tragic authors find the subjects in legendary material. In this, he is just a descriptive scientist describing what's there. He writes, the best tragedies are founded on the story of a few houses, on the fortunes of Alcmaeon, Oedipus, Orestes, and a few more. But this happened, he says, because these present good cases of those who have done or suffered something terrible. In other words, his criteria are purely of what makes good psychological drama. His strongly expressed distaste for the deus ex machina also shows clearly that he wants power operating in tragedy to be of this world as he wants its heroes in their behavior. There is a hint in the Poetics to the second item in Webster's list, the moral stature of the heroes and heroines. This is in the word spudaion in the definition of tragedy. Halliwell translates spudaion as serious but also elevated, indicating, he writes, the importance of the act imitated but also the gravity of tone. Also, spudaioi are its protagonists. They are the great people, but in what sense are they great? Certainly not in that of being perfect. This is made totally clear both in the Poetics and in the plays. In fact, it is essential that the tragic characters be flawed because so much in tragedy depends on the flaw, the hamartia, the mistakes that cause so much. Perhaps it is best to say, rather than great, grand. Tragedy is definitely not kitchen sink drama. Its protagonists are kings and queens and princes, heroes and demigods. But there is a very special sense in which all these grand people are spudaioi, a sense which is another aspect of their heroic descent from the oral tradition of archaic Greece. Tragic heroes are what they are. They are great in the sense that they are larger than life, and that's naturally seen as prototypical. It is in this sense that tragedy, unlike history, which is about human beings with a clear position in time and place, is best fit to deal with the katholu, the universal. Orestes is not your run-of-the-mill matricide, and it is not the specific murder of Clytemnestra that is judged in the Eumenides, but the very act of matricide. In fact, even more, the act, but also all that it stands for as metaphor. But for the metaphor to operate in its full strength, it needs the nexus of meanings in which the legend was lodged in the oral tradition. It is this that gives heroes their grandness, their moral statures, that guarantees their value as archetypes. When this degenerates, the metaphors in which they star lose their power. But perhaps the clearest of all the signs that the Poetics was written at a time when the moment of tragedy was dead and gone was that Aristotle views its main purpose as psychological or cognitive, catharsis. And this brings us lastly to Webster's third aspect ignored by Aristotle, the chorus. This omission is the more remarkable to us as we consider the chorus tragedy's most distinctive formal characteristic. In fact, what most distinguishes it from the theatre of later ages, including our own. In fact, the only concrete thing that Aristotle says about the chorus is that its function should be as in Sophocles and not as in Euripides. But what he means, the reason he gives is formal. In Sophocles he writes, the chorus is treated as one of the actors, is part of the whole and participates. Thus, here we have again Aristotle the rationalist, wanting to assign to the chorus a role that fits in with his ideas of organic unity, the solid principles of verisimilitude and realism. He likes it best when it is just another logical piece of the action, an actor, rather than a purely theatrical convention, this more Euripidean sense of a group of musically gifted hangers-on doing the occasional song and dance. But if we read the tragedies and the poetics, each in its own context, as we should, it becomes more understandable that Aristotle completely disregards the crucial function we see in the chorus, the one that every modern schoolboy, and schoolgirl of course, knows to be there, the chorus as the voice of the city. The Poetics, don't forget, was written in the time of Alexander the Great, also Aristotle's greatest student, a man renowned for many things, but not for his firm advocacy of majority rule. But though the Athens of 330 BC could perhaps still be thought of nominally as a democracy, it was definitely no more a great imperial capital, and hardly even a state with a mind of its own, just another city following the great Macedonian. So much had changed from the 5th century when Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides wrote. Even the theatre of Dionysus, where the plays were first performed, was in ruins, as it is today, but had to be rebuilt in this time by Lycurgus, a great lover of the old tragedy, a monument to an art that was already being venerated as classical 5th century tragedy, and thus, in a sense, already in a process of embalmment. The communal voice that the chorus spoke in the 5th century, mostly in Aeschylus and Sophocles, is not just the voice of the city, as an abstraction, of course. It is also, perhaps mainly, the voice of a more archaic mentality, the consciousness of an older world, which includes appeals to divine law, custom, proverbial common sense, all things guiding the life of the polis before the hubris of democracy set in, which is very much the hubris of deciding what's best through something called logos, something that is not really at all well defined as essence, but quite clear when it operates as process. It is something, in addition, that does not provide, as the Peloponnesian Wars showed only too well, a permanent guarantee of a superior life. I discuss tragedy both through the Poetics and independently of it in order to learn things that can be useful to me as a writer. Any attempt to summarize them, especially in the form of this bad symptom of the digital age, the bullet point, is certainly partly to trivialize them, especially so if this is done by a normally garrulous modern Athenian. Still, as I don't want to be accused of shying away from the challenge of my title, I will practice, very briefly, as befits it, the Laconian virtue. To me, as a writer, the great lesson of tragedy is that a culture can achieve an art form that, while being highly audience-friendly, manages to be profoundly serious, dealing with matters of great importance to the culture, not just as a collection of individuals, but as a community. That this art form does not have to be either exclusively of the temple or the marketplace, but can belong to a conceptual space partaking of both, to which nowadays perhaps only art can give a local habitation, especially an art mixing in modern terms high and low or popular elements. That this art form can resist a restrictive, one-dimensional explanatory viewpoint, such as the intellectualism and psychologism that eventually stultified 4th century tragedy, or the varieties of sociologism or other forms of ism that are more fashionable today. That in order to achieve its seriousness, this art form has to focus especially on the open spaces, the tension between the two elements of some highly significant dyads, divine and human, individual and group, self and other, life and death, birth, decay, reason and instinct, old and new, is either in their naked form or in the various metonymies that incarnate them in the modern world. Finally, that in order to fulfill its purpose, this art form has to respect the demands of forms that are accessible to non-elite audiences, forms cultivated as a rule in practice. The reason why tragedy especially can inspire us in these lessons is that it was born in an age that was so self-consciously transitory, an age that knew it was caught between worlds, the one, paraphrasing Matthew Arnold, not quite dead yet, the other quickly being born. But every age is transitory. The greatness of the age that encompassed the moment of tragedy was that it was aware of the fact and created in tragedy an art form that faces this condition in its stark, naked harshness, that dares to shatter the illusion of our independence from the past, which is really the illusion of our being free of the constraints of our humanity. What I'm referring to here is perhaps a variation of what is sometimes called the tragic situation or the tragic view. This view is one in which the poet, rather than make choices between the opposing forces that determine our lives, this is the role of the theorist, the social critic, the politician perhaps, tries to put them in dialogue, giving to art, literature, poetry its highest role as an essential voice in Michael Oakeshott's memorable phrase, in the conversation of mankind. I will conclude with a tribute to the local lares, the larites or household gods, lest they, as Constantin Cavafy might say, begin to tremble, lest they burrow in the depths of their shrine, not in terror, but in anger for their exclusion. We should never forget, writers or readers, but writers especially, that the gift of listening to the voice of tragedy in a way that makes it intelligible is a gift given to us through classical scholarship. And it is only through the ongoing struggle of classical scholarship in its various forms to understand the past by bringing it to us at the same time as it brings us to it, somewhat as tragedy did, that we can hope to keep the classical world alive. This is not in order to resurrect any of its externals, this would be pointless, but as beacon, and perhaps to writers especially as benchmark of what great heights art can achieve. At a time when classical studies are being attacked, either directly for being irrelevant, this of course is the attack of the Philistines, or perhaps more dangerously, because more invisibly, by attempts to make them too relevant. Just another case of a study of culture, any culture, and this is the attack of the new sophists. It is crucial to understand their value in bringing us closer to the importance of classical culture by contributing to its better understanding in context. Without this understanding, we are blind to its true greatness. Ancient Greek culture and tragedy as a basic emanation of it become significant to our times only if we understand and to the degree to which it was significant to its own time. To understand this significance with the help of classical scholarship is to study and understand tragedy's greatest lesson. Thank you.